Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Lisa Palmer, and I'm the Associate Professor and Deputy Director of this SLRC. Thank you for joining us for the second episode in the Unsettled Multiculturalisms webinar series. Today, we'll be exploring post-colonial entanglements of Windrush and Blackness. Unfortunately, Dr. Azizat Johnson can't join us for today's episode, but we are sending her love and solidarity to her this evening. So tonight, we are truly excited to host another lineup of fantastic guests. We are joined by Zita Holborn. Zita is an award-winning human rights and equality campaigner and trade union community activist, author, artist, curator, poet, and vocalist. Zita is the co-founder of the national chair of Barak UK, which campaigns against austerity, racism, injustice, migrant and refugee rights, and for Windrush justice. Welcome, Zita. Our next guest is Augustino Pinnock. Augustino is a PhD researcher at the Center for Doctoral Training, Feminism, Sexual Politics, and Visual Culture in the Department of Geology and the Environment at Loughborough University. His research traces the links between contested histories, art making, and visuality as tools for Black identity and peacemaking in post-independence Jamaica. Welcome, Augustino.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jade Bentel. Jade is a Black feminist historian and PhD candidate in the Faculty of History at the University of Oxford. Her work maps the genealogies of Black women's histories of refusal and resistance, both in Britain and throughout the Black diaspora. Welcome, Jade.
Thank you very much, Lisa.
Our next guest is Luke de Noronha. Luke is an academic and writer at the Sarah Parker Redmond Centre at University College London. He's the author of Deporting Black Britons, an ethnography of deportation that helps us better understand the anti-immigrant times we are living through. He has written widely on the politics of immigration, racism, and deportation for The Guardian, Verso Books, Vice, Red Pepper, and Open Democracy. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you.
And we welcome back Dr. Denise Noble. Denise is a scholar and writer who has taught Black Studies, Sociology, Media and Cultural Studies in universities in the UK and the US. And she's the author of Decolonizing and Feminizing Freedom, a Caribbean genealogy, and is also a contributor to Unsettled Multiculturalisms. Denise will be joining us later on in the episode to take part in our panel discussion. So what I want to do is also remind our audience that the chat will be open, and we encourage you to get involved with live tweeting using the hashtag 2020 transruptions. So this evening, I'm going to kick off with a quick summary of Professor Hess's discussion on the symbolic meaning of Windrush in the post-war era. And then I'll ask our speakers to present their papers and their contributions to tonight's episode. And we will then be joined by Denise for the panel discussion, and this will be followed by a Q&A. So please use the chat function to add any questions that you want to field to our panelists. In last week's episode, Professor Hess's keynote paper revisited the symbolic meaning of Windrush to explain the idea of multicultural transruptions in three particular moments in the post-war period. First, in 1948, the arrival of Caribbean migrants on the ship Empire Windrush, and those that followed was marked in the 1950s with racist attacks and slogans demanding "Keep Britain White." Here, Windrush symbolized what Professor Hesse called the Black problem. The second symbolic moment occurred in 1998 to mark the 50th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush. This anniversary was publicly celebrated, and its role in the modern formation of Black Britain was lauded, as was its role in energizing and activating an anti-racism movement in Britain. Taking place only 6 years after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence and the ongoing campaign against the sabotaged police investigations, the 50th anniversary celebrations of Windrush symbolized what Professor Hesse called Black staying power. The third symbolic moment occurred in 2018, when the racist violations of the Windrush Scandal became public and exposed how many Caribbean migrants to Britain during the 1950s and 60s were being wrongly detained, denied legal rights, and in some cases deported because they were deemed to be illegal immigrants. These abuses, which arose from the Conservative government's hostile environment policy in 2012, attacked and violated settled Black citizens. Once again, Black activism was mobilized to defend Black communities, to expose and shame the government, to try and force them to backtrack, if not recant. Hence, Windrush was symbolized, according to Professor Hesse, as the Black condition. So this week, our panel will engage questions around the colonial spectre of Windrush in the context of the Windrush Scandal, in order to engage further its entanglements and transruptions, to take into consideration the changing formation of Black British diaspora formations. So I want to invite our first guest this evening to open up with her talk. So I'm going to invite Zita Holborn to present her talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening and greetings, everybody. I'm not an academic. I'm a campaigner, human rights campaigner and activist. And I've been campaigning against racism and discrimination and injustice that Black communities and workers and service users face for many years. And the Windrush Scandal is one of those things in the center of that campaigning. And Barrack was established in 2010 to campaign around the disproportionate adverse impacts of austerity and cuts that were proposed on Black communities and Black workers. And we quickly realized that actually hand in hand with those austerity impacts came deepening discrimination and deepening injustice for our communities, and indeed an attack on migrant communities, and not just new migrant communities, people new to the UK, but established communities that had been here for years, even decades, which included the Windrush generation. And we find ourselves as second generation or even third generation in the UK, still being classified as immigrants, asked, where do we come from? No, where do we really come from? And we're not accepted as British citizens or deemed to be British citizens. We're judged on colour and race and ethnicity, even after generations and generations in the UK. So 2010, Barrack was formed, and in 2012, the government announced that there would be new legislation, an immigration bill coming through, amendments to the existing immigration law. We shouldn't forget that that immigration law that came in under Enoch Power, proposed by Enoch Power in his Rivers of Blood speech, sought to target migrants from the Caribbean then, as it did later on in 2010 and beyond. And we were warning in Barrack that this legislation wasn't going to just target people who were new migrants to the UK or overseas students, but was going to target established communities, including those of the Windrush generation. And whilst many people will think of the Windrush generation as being those people who came from the Caribbean, actually the people that are being targeted are people from the African and Asian continents and regions. So people who are black and brown, but there was a particular impact on Caribbean communities in this targeting for detention and deportation and criminalization effectively of our communities by virtue of our immigration status. And we found that actually there wasn't a huge amount of support for what we were saying. And so we co-founded with other organizations, Black-led organizations, migrant rights groups, and we brought trade unions on board, the movement against xenophobia, specifically to campaign against the immigration bill, what it represented. But at the time, we also saw that there was a shift to the right of all mainstream political parties in the UK. And with the exception of a handful of Labour MPs, there was very little support for our campaign. Nevertheless, you know, we did organise protests, lobbies of Parliament, and sought to influence elements of that legislation coming through. But the reality is that the majority of people who were targeted under the so-called Windrush Scandal were people that had no understanding or that there was any problem or any issue with their immigration status. Because if we look back to the 1950s and 60s, when they arrived in the UK, they were told that they were part of the British Empire. So they were British on arrival. And we know now that the landing cards were destroyed by the government, showing that evidence of how people came in and why they came in. And that is a direct link to the legacies of colonialism and enslavement. So on one hand, when Britain wanted people to help the country recover post-World War II and to take up jobs in the public sector, on transport, in the NHS, and so on and so forth, and help the country recover, many of those people continued lifelong jobs working in those sectors, providing a public service, paying taxes, raising families, raising children, and raising grandchildren. When it came to them being targeted for deportation, they were just labeled as illegal immigrants. And at the root of all of this is racism. I cannot see any other way or define it any other way. At the time when the stories were unfolding of what was happening, you had people saying, no, it just must be sort of administrative errors. You know, it wasn't a deliberate targeting of these communities, of Caribbean communities. But it was, because we could see that racism globally had increased, and it had certainly deepened and increased in the UK. But when it came to us trying to encourage people, if they identified that there may be an issue with their immigration status, to try and get that regularized, don't wait until they're being targeted for deportation. The stigma attached to that and the worry about that meant that lots of people didn't come forward. Plus, there's the financial impact of trying to do that, to get legal representation, to pay fees, and so on. So many people didn't find out that there was an issue until they were literally snatched and detained and told that they were going to be deported, or that they had gone back to the countries that they were born in for a holiday or to a funeral or to a wedding, and that they were allowed to leave on the passports they had. They were not told that there was any problem, but when it came to them returning to the UK, they were told that they couldn't return, and they found themselves effectively exiled from the UK for years, even decades, fighting for justice and fighting to come back. And in fact, it wasn't really until the so-called Windrush Scandal broke out and the government apologized that any of those people got any type of support to come back. So Barrack UK, together with our umbrella organization, BAME Lawyers for Justice, who campaign on these issues, campaigned to raise awareness, to provide legal support, to lobby the government, to get people's stories in the press. And 2 years before the scandal broke, there was a piece I wrote in The Guardian asking how can 50 people be snatched, which was about a mass deportation of 50 people to Jamaica, many of whom were of the Windrush generation. And it's interesting to see when we look at how racism plays out, whose voices are listened to and whose voices aren't listened to. So when it's black grassroots organizations saying this is racist, this is happening, people weren't listening. But nevertheless, the scandal was exposed. The government apologized, if you can call it an apology. But the reality is people think that the Windrush scandal is over and that's the end of it. But the truth is that the vast majority of people haven't received compensation. Some people have died. Some people have taken their lives when they were deported. There are people that have been killed after they were deported, and there are people through the stress, the impact on their mental health and physical health of what happened, destitution, losing their jobs, losing their homes, losing everything, have died before receiving that compensation. But in addition to that, the legacy of colonialism, of enslavement, of the targeting of black communities, of deepening racism, and of the Windrush scandal means that to this very day, the descendants of the Windrush generation, the children and the grandchildren of the Windrush generation, are still being targeted for deportation. And the government and the media try and label these people as hardened criminals who have nothing to do with the Windrush generation. But the reality is, for those who, some have been criminalized because of immigration status, others have been criminalized because of institutional racism, more likely to get harsher prison sentences or custodial sentences for the same things as their white counterparts, but are also living in an environment where they are facing horrific discrimination and racism and injustice and poverty and disproportionate impacts of austerity. So we have to understand their life experience in the UK in that context. And when the government say, well, they're nothing to do with the Windrush generation, they are. The direct link to being in the UK now and here is because of their family that came before. And the family that came before were invited to the UK, came here to work with no intention of staying, thought that they would make money and go back, but ended up staying here and building lives, contributing to the economy, contributing to British society, and benefiting this society actually as well in many different ways, economically amongst them. And they are here, subsequent generations, because of the fact that colonialism happened and enslavement happened. And I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop on that point. Thank you.
Zita, thank you for that powerful introduction. I think, the takeaway from your talk, there's a lot to take away from your talk, actually, but the kind of concept that is ringing in my mind at the moment is the idea of the deepening racism. And I think that is really kind of pivotal in understanding what's been happening with Windrush and why we're continuing to see the way in which the rights of Black and Brown people in this country are being kind of stripped away in very systematic ways. I now want to move on to introduce Augustino. Augustino?
Ready for me?
We're ready.
Okay, brilliant. So first, let me just say good evening to everyone who's watching. And I just want to thank Lisa for, including me in this very awesome event. Just two quick notations. There's a story of mine that's on the website, and under the tag it says, Jamaican history. It's not really Jamaican history. What it is it's the story's focusing on a piece of community existence that really we do need to talk about in Jamaica, but people have a difficulty sometimes treating with. And just to also correct that I'm in the Department of Geography and the Environment at Loughborough University. So to go to my presentation, which I've titled, and I want to say that it's a little left of center of the conversation around Windrush. So I come to Windrush almost via a detour. And so I've called my presentation, "You Can't Have a Black Man in Space, Geographic Notes on Becoming British in Steve McQueen's Small Acts." So I'm talking about Small Acts as a way to get to Windrush. Small Acts is a televisual memorial of Black West Indian settlement in Britain. Its sense of history is paralleled only by its imagination of the future. The 6 hours and 46 minutes long event in many ways classically defines what Hazel Carby might call imperial intimacies, to reference the networked and the entangled relationship between the two spaces, Britain and the West Indies. However, for all of Small Acts' achievements, its handling of the historical details of the past runs a very real danger of reinscribing many colonial stereotypes about Blackness, Black masculinities, and specifically the Caribbean and Jamaica, which continue to haunt the contemporary British imaginary. The statement then, "You can't have a Black man in space," helps to demarcate these boundaries. It highlights in sharp relief, for me at least, the continuing legacies of race, racism, and colonial investments, which are recuperated into the present, and which sadly also form part of the architecture of meanings by which Black Britishness begins to map its own world making, at least as far as director Steve McQueen is concerned. So then space holds an array of meanings for McQueen's storytelling, specific to the question of race and racialization in Small Acts. And so the comment about Black men in space, which is taken from the final installment in the 5-part anthology Education, is said to 12-year-old Kingsley Smith by his white male classmate. Kingsley is ridiculed for his aspiration of wanting to be an astronaut. And so for me, the comment aptly encodes the tensions between the white gaze and the spatial politics of race, British nationhood, and Black futures, all of which are interwoven into the structure and the flow of the narrative. And just to say that this is, in a sense, how I'm defining space as a kind of spatial metaphor, looking at these different kinds of relationships. And so in this sense, then, the story is more than the sum of its parts, posing searching questions which resonate beyond the immediate remit of the storytelling or the immediate forum of the storytelling. And so the cocktail of Blackness, space, and the past, more specifically a West Indian past, as summed up in the comment, is of particular interest to me. On the face of it, the statement about Black men in space directly implicates Black West Indian masculinities as they're viewed in Britain, both in the past and likely also the present, as well as in the series itself. The statement likely also points to their eventual transformation into ideal British subjects who can more readily fit into space over time. However, there's more to it. The otherwise innocuous quip, which is said to an equally innocent Kingsley, is anything but. As noted then, it is a crucial comment on the politics of space and race in Britain and the toll they exact on those who must negotiate them. So read in a wider context then of the fittingly entitled Education episode, the declaration for me effectively is a calculus of Black presence in Britain and the possibilities of creating space in its harsh, alien environment for the newly arrived. In effect, the statement encapsulates the demands and the dangers of Black space making in the sense in which Jamaican author and sociologist Erna Brodba invokes the concept as a kind of shorthand to exploring the fullness of emancipation in the context of Jamaica's political independence. So the virtual impossibility of Black men in space, then specific to the immediate aftermath of Windrush and its various afterlives, is as much a reference to that history as well as Windrush itself. And so it offers, for me at least, a starting point for us to begin to think about Blackness in Britain, the reverberations of which are clearly felt in the present, as might be seen in the previously mentioned education episode, which interestingly is the most modern of all the stories and is enveloped in what Christina Sharp might call the ongoing weather of anti-Black racism. Ironically, however, Windrush is never explicitly referenced in the series, which leads me to wonder why. What does this directorial decision do for our understanding of Black British experiences beyond West Indian settlers, given that it continues to happen even now? The last deportation flight, dubiously referred to as Jamaica 50, left London Heathrow Phenomenon Manley International Airport in Kingston on December 2, 2020. But none of this comes up for mentioning in Small Acts, and I found that to be very curious. In addition, then, as a cartographic route into recovering one specific set of histories of Blackness in Britain, Small Acts is very much a conversation about white space. So the inevitability and the apparent impossibility of Black men, and I would argue women, in space, meaning the British nation space, suggests that the story does not attempt to go beyond the political demarcations of whiteness as a normative border. It raises the questions but never fully addresses them. And so in this sense, then, geography is as much about material space as it's also relative and imaginative. And the ending of the education episode signifies on its beginning, quite literally, and leaving open the question about what might be hoped for in Britain by Black subjects who inhabit the fictional universe of Small Acts, as well as the real world of Britain, as the camera pans away from the orbiting planets rotating on their various axes in the mock solar system of space. So then, as a visual accounting then of Black British history, Small Acts is problematically reinstantiating or reinscribing these binaries of center margin geographies of the metropole and the colony. And this is especially in how it elides key aspects of Black West Indian experiences related to, say, gender and culture. And I mentioned the Windrush Scandal as one example, but also I'm noting how women are not really the story doesn't center on them. So that, you know, perhaps with the exception of, say, Lover's Rock. So as a narrative then, which is locating contemporary iterations of Black British presence, you know, Windrush is never addressed. And I think that that is curious, you know, and we have to ask ourselves a question as to why that is. You know, there are other instances, of course, concerning how the actual processes of arrival, you know, the arrival of Black West Indian subjects to Britain never gets told. The story is only located within the boundaries and the borders of Britain itself, and is told from the perspectives of those who are born here. And so it deliberately ignores the Caribbean, even as it attempts to recover elements of its contemporary history, in this case, Jamaica, specific to, say, Lover's Rock, which I just mentioned, where Franklin explicitly identifies himself as originating from Portmore. And this is ironic because Portmore, at this time in Jamaica's development and history, this is 1979, 1980, Portmore is not yet an established community with a defined identity, as he's suggesting. So then of note, and this now is the part that I find most interesting, or perhaps one of the more interesting points, Small Acts, despite the fact that it is in many ways a story about West Indian settlement in Britain, it is currently unavailable for viewing by Amazon Prime customers in the physical location of the actual Caribbean from which they come. And so in some sense then, this is aligning with my view about how space-time is being dilated in such a way as to distort the Caribbean presence in the story. It fits in with the project of erasure and disremembering that in some sense plays out in the narrative and also speaks to the high costs of Britishness to Black subjects descended from the region. Therefore, in some sense, or in another sense, really, part of my project here today is to vaguely retrace or color over those cartographies of Caribbean history from Small Acts, even as a Caribbean, in inverted commas, is often ill-defined in the story. The stories are all British-centered, with no real historicizing of the roots of the community outside of and beyond Britain. And we have to ask why that is. So then, as a Caribbean national myself, I also note that it is mostly because of my physical location in Britain, which has aided that process. I'm interested then in how these geographic histories, or what Keguro Macharia might call geohistories, intersect with my own lived experiences, and how these are being mediated by an observable anxiety about either being related to the Caribbean or contesting the primacy of its logics in producing Black British history. Note, here I'm suggesting that the Caribbean as a geopolitical, spatial, and discursive set of coordinates is central to any understanding of contemporary Britain, more specifically Black British history. And of course, this is a longer discussion, which I will not detain myself with today. However, it is sufficient to argue that any understanding of Empire Britain, regardless of which side of the Atlantic we're standing on, as well as beyond, necessarily requires an engagement with the Caribbean in a very real sense. So that for me, it is notable that McQueen's filmic history makes no attempt to offer more than a backdrop association with the region in small acts. And so to kind of wrap up what I'm trying to say in this conversation that we're having, that my discussion is twofold. On the one hand, it is bound up in and underwritten by an examination of some of the fault lines over which McQueen is traveling in his literal making of history in what might then be called a more capacious post-colonial geography, meaning the expanded relationship between the historical Caribbean and the fictional world of small acts. And also, by evaluating the statement made to Kingsley in the education episode, I am refiguring McQueen's narrative as a post-colonial crisis about the future and the possibilities or impossibilities, the possibilities of occupying space as the crushing weight of empire is everywhere to be seen. And that plays out several times in the story. So in effect then, I'm asking, what are the costs of this dynamic and who suffers the most in how the stories are told when situated in the wider context of history and the sort of history-making project that McQueen is on? And so I will just leave that question open for discussion at the, when we move into the next section. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Agostino, and raising some really powerful questions, putting them on the table, particularly around questions of erasure, the impossibility of Black men and women within British space. Again, these are kind of points that we can pick up in the panel discussion. I'd like to move on now to invite Jade to present her paper.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Palmer, Dr. Perry, and the Stephen Lawrence Research Centre for inviting me to be part of such an exciting discussion this evening. When I was thinking about what I might be able to contribute to this evening's discussion, I really wanted to meditate on the ways in which Black migration and presence within the imperial core are framed within the white colonial imagination. Thinking along with Professor Hesse's work on multicultural transruptions, I'm interested in how the histories of Black resistance, refusal, and rebellion are staging grounds to rupture, contest, and create ways of being in the world that exceed all that is foreclosed within the imperial project. In the past 3 years, since the so-called Windrush Scandal first broke throughout the national news cycle, one of the many things that has struck me is the malleability of this moment called Windrush. The iconography of the Empire Windrush and the hundreds of Black migrants on board that day serve a particular function within the infrastructure of national memory. Black migrants are available to be instrumentalized within a narrative of celebration that emphasizes the benevolence of empire, the genesis of British race relations, and the triumphs of multiculturalism. At the same time, Black migrants are also available to be exposed to the gratuitous violence and brutal technologies of state governance. Both of these functions are violent in their corporality. The fungibility of Windrush is the fungibility of Blackness. To attend to the ways in which Windrush is engaged within the public space, I've written a short piece that performs memory work in the grammar of archival retrieval, speculation, and critical fabulation to think about who is remembered, how they are remembered, and what must be forgotten for the narratives of multiculturalism, nation, and empire to endure. The national story starts when the ship first emerges on the horizon. It begins on a summer's day in June 1948, when the sounds echoing from that ship grow closer and closer, the music of elsewhere ringing into the docks. It reaches a crescendo as the ship finally comes to a standstill, the gentle motion of the water beneath it rocking the passengers back and forth, holding them in its sway. In this telling, the new emigres look out at the scene before them, some open-mouthed in awe, others gasping at the something close to the sublime unfolding before their very eyes. They were finally here, and they couldn't quite believe it. In the national story, these men in their wide-brimmed hats and sharp-tailored suits will account for nearly all the passengers on board. They were all ex-servicemen who had served their mother country proudly and faithfully until the very end, and who were now back once more to heed its call. If any woman is remembered at all, it will be the one or two who were considered exceptional enough to be remembered, the women whose light skin and wavy hair marks them out as those who could afford to purchase a first-class ticket and travel in style for each of the 4,700 miles across the sea. In this version of events, the official story that will be recited at commemorative galas and Olympic ceremonies and award evenings by prime ministers and home secretaries, the passengers on board the ship are animated by one enduring conviction: the duty to empire, always to empire. The national story starts when this group of esteemed citizens begin to disembark. There's a flurry of activity along the dock as the captive audience, eager to catch a first glimpse of their fellow countrymen, snap into action. Reporters begin scribbling away in their notepads, their words teeming with only the most important details that will freeze this moment in time for the next 72 years. The sound of a camera shutter depressing filters through the crowd. Once the first photograph has been taken, it becomes a flurry of activity, each photojournalist vying to capture the best shot of the hundreds of people who will first be called the dark strangers who found their way to Britain, but later recalled as the devoted patriots making their way home. It won't be long before the footage captured on the newsreel will be called up upon time and time again to furnish this fiction of nation. It will tell the story as we are supposed to remember it, a narrative that recounts only this boat and not the thousands of boats before it. In this telling, this ship emerges without precedent or history, but becomes an incubator for terms such as race relations and progress, multiculturalism, and citizenship. If the arrival of the passengers on the boat is marked by the history of slave forts, the memory of the barracoon and the coffle line, the spectre of the door of no return, and the ghost of 12 million and more, there is no mention of it here. In the vast romance of empire, this ship marks the dawn of a new day, the triumph of liberal democracy, and the destiny of a nation. The national story begins to unravel with the story of the stowaway. The footage captured within the newsreel fails to catalogue her, but she's there too. In the pictures from that day, she lingers in the background, out of sight and out of frame, intent on evading capture through the cameraman's lens or having her name recorded in the marginalia of some journalist's notepad or the register of some police officer. She is the uninvited migrant, the misnamed sojourner, the woman who must be forgotten so that history can proceed. If the reporters and the journalists and the photographers notice her at all, they record her name as Avril or Eva or Elizabeth, both a misnaming on their part and a withholding on hers. When they ask her just how she managed to steal her way across the ocean, she mentions only that there were no prospects back home. She doesn't mention that no prospects was, slightly listen my pace. She doesn't mention that no prospects was the condition first conferred upon her mother and her mother's mother, or that this is her inheritance within the world in which she is enclosed, or that no prospects is a synonym for the wretched of the earth. She doesn't mention the tearful goodbyes said to children who will no longer recognize her in a couple of years, or the words exchanged with the grandmother she'll never see again. She doesn't mention the details of just how exactly she'd made her way onto a ship called Empire, or that the choice to slip onto the boat hadn't really been a choice at all. She doesn't tell them about the night she spent in the darkest part of the deck, hiding away until everyone else had fallen asleep. When a journalist presses her for details, she doesn't tell them about the cook who discovered her in the kitchens after dark, or the names of the passengers who'd fed her and clothed her, or how this alone had been her sustenance. She doesn't mention the kindness of strangers, or the names of the many she now calls her kin, or the mutual aid societies that unfolded in steerage when the rest of the world was asleep, and all they'd had was each other. In a small print of the tiny article that doesn't bear her name, she doesn't say that a penny here and a fiver there had purchased her ticket, or that this had been the only difference between arriving as a citizen and arriving as an illegal immigrant. This is the story that will never be printed, the words that fall on the outskirts of nation. The official story will not, cannot, must not hold her truth, but she is the truth of the world. The national story unravels with the history of conquest. It becomes undone by the memory of ships sailing in the distance, with the Royal African Company and the maritime insurance claim, with the item in the ledger and the bill of sale. The national story unravels with the year 1661. It becomes undone by the slave patrols in Barbados and the advent of the police, by the words partus sequitur ventrum and the maternal inheritance, by the rule of law and the law of man. The national story unravels in the 18th century, when the police waged war on the black singers and sex workers, the chimney sweepers and the wanderers. It becomes undone in 1785 with the proposal to repatriate black migrants from London to Freetown. The fiction that Britain wants us to remember falls apart with the scramble for Africa. It becomes undone when war comes to the colonies and the mother country calls. When the armistice is signed and the confetti settles, when the aliens' order is made law and 3,000 black and Arab migrants are removed from their homes, the national story cannot hold. The national narrative falls apart when we remember the lynching of Charles Wotton by a white mob on the docks of Liverpool. It unravels with the freedom dream shared in the West Indian Students' Union, the parties and saloons hosted at the Florence Mills Social Club, the longings for liberation whispered at the League of Coloured Peoples. The national story becomes undone with the communities formed after the ocean voyage, the fluidity of kinship and the threads of affiliation. The meals cooked in cramped kitchens, the money gathered for the partner, the love expressed across the table in the basement nightclub and at the all-night shebeen tell a radically different story of a radically different world. The national story unravels with the West Indian Gazette. It buckles under the weight of Depo-Provera and forced sterilization, ununiversal healthcare and reproductive unfreedom. The national story becomes undone when a mother's home becomes a crime scene, when her children are stolen away in the middle of the night. The Border and the Nationality Act, the War on Terror and the Prevent Strategy, the austerity measures and the vans marked Go Home are all conveyors of the history the national story refuses to name. 7 decades after the boat arrives, when the fiction has been woven and the story has become legend, thousands will gather in the streets. They will bear witness to the misremembered and the disremembered, chant the names of the uncounted, sing the freedom dreams of the dead. When the statue is pulled down and dumped at the bottom of the harbour, they make a promise to each other. They vow to never forget. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. That was fantastic. Really powerful contribution, and so much to unpack around the kind of notion of the nation unraveling under the spectrum of its colonial kind of legacy and the kind of deeply rooted racism that exists. So again, these are kind of so much to think about and so much to discuss in the question and answer. I'm so looking forward to that. But we'll move on to Luke.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay. In some ways, what was surprising about the Windrush scandal was that it actually became a scandal in the first place. Of course, it should be scandalous that people were and are treated as the so-called Windrush migrants were. But the point is that most forms of state violence, racist discrimination, enforced destitution, detention, expulsion, and brutal neglect are not newsworthy. And sympathy for those defined as, in law, illegal immigrants is hardly in abundance. Thinking about the Windrush scandal, we should all, of course, be very wary when we heard Jacob Rees-Mogg describe the treatment of Windrush migrants as fundamentally un-British, and the Daily Mail joining the chorus with their faux sympathy and manufactured outrage. We should also be frustrated by the ways in which the Labour Party played into a good migrant, bad migrant kind of logic in their response, and sought to fold so-called Windrush migrants into the nation as citizens, rather than attacking the violent system of immigration controls much more broadly, which, this system of immigration controls impacts the nieces, nephews, cousins, friends, and extended families of those same Windrush migrants. It should be an obvious anti-racist principle that immigration controls are not unjust because they target the wrong people who should have been citizens or refugees, but because they produce and reproduce racialized global disparities, restricting the mobility of the global poor and racially undesirable. And because policies like the hostile environment lead to the surveillance, illegalization, and banishment of our friends, colleagues, neighbors, and family members, while turning us all into border guards, checking and being checked. The Windrush Scandal was a chance to reckon with this violent and cruel system, the hostile environment, and also contemporary borders more broadly. In some ways, the scandal opened up space for us all to discuss and critique and struggle against immigration controls, as Zita described very well. But in other ways, it was a missed opportunity, and we saw a reaffirmation of the nation, even if performatively the boundaries were redrawn to try and include a group of racialized people. That was not substantive. That was a performance, I would say, of multicultural inclusion. Not really any substantive legal change or proper compensation was provided for those subject to these policies. And we can discuss some of this in the Q&A if people want to talk about this take on the Windrush Scandal. And perhaps the reason why I've said so-called Windrush migrants, because I want to be critical of the way they emerge as a category. Particularly those who arrived before 1973 was kind of a new category. But we can discuss that in the Q&A if it's useful. Now what I want to do is focus on the deportation of so-called foreign criminals, which is the issue that I work on. Some people may remember that the 3 charter flights, the mass deportation flights Zita was talking about, to Jamaica that have gone since the Windrush Scandal have all been justified by the apparent serious criminality of everyone who was forced onto them. And you may also remember that Sajid Javid, in his brief time as Home Secretary, said that Windrush migrants with criminal records would not be eligible for legal remedy or compensation. In my view, I think writing about foreign criminals demands more interesting and more radical forms of critique than making special pleading for individual groups of deserving migrants. For this event, I thought it might be useful to talk a bit about why I called my book Deporting Black Britons, not because I want to just focus on the book necessarily, but because I think it offers some important ways into the arguments that I'm trying to make about racism, immigration control, and contemporary Britain that I think are important when we're thinking about post-colonial entanglements of Windrush and Blackness. So firstly, why deportation? When a state deports people, it affirms the value of citizenship through negation. Those we deport are not us, and their expulsion confirms that we as citizens belong because unlike them, we cannot be deported. Deportation also echoes that well-worn racist demand, heard on the streets, in classrooms and at the bus stop, that we should go back to our countries, to where we are really from. Deportation fulfills the dreams of repatriation that have circulated since the docking of the Empire Windrush at Tilbury. In this context, and for anti-racists in particular, looking at who is deported, how and why, offers important insights into how British racism is functioning now, against whom and with what effects. Okay, so to understand racism, this is my argument, we should focus not only on inequality within the political community, but on the very ways in which some people are legally and spatially excluded and expelled from the British nation. The second bit of the title, why is Black Britons? So why Black Britons? Why describe people who've been deported as Black Britons? It's deliberately provocative, of course, because the UK is deporting people it defines as non-citizens and so apparently returning them home. So describing the people who I met in Jamaica as Black Britons is partly to try and fasten on conversations about immigration control to conversations like this, where we try and think about Black Britain, the experiences of Black people and other people of colour living in Britain, histories of racism and resistance, and what has changed and what has stayed the same since the Windrush docked at Tilbury, which I think all of our presentations speak to, actually. And the story that people often tell about the history of Black Britain goes something like this, and this is not an accurate story, but it's a deliberately kind of mythological and thinned out story. So first came the Windrush generation, although some may and should acknowledge that there have been Black people in Britain for much longer. This generation, according to the familiar story, experienced informal colour bars and discrimination at work, in housing and welfare, and yet they remained hardworking, respectable. And then there were their children, the first generation born here, often described as the rebel generation, who lived in and through Thatcher's Britain and who were in revolt against the injustices of structural racism in the only country they had known, particularly against the police. After this, though, my sense is that the picture becomes less clear, the story we tell becomes less clear. Clearly, the third and fourth, maybe fifth generation of Black Britons are still violated by structural and institutional racism, but perhaps people have a sense that they are less politically organised. And clearly, the preponderance of migration from Africa in the last few decades rather than the Caribbean is important to this story. There are more people living in the UK, according to the 2011 census, who were born in Nigeria than in Jamaica, for example. Of course, these generational shorthands are gross oversimplifications and they're partly just mythology, but my intervention when calling the book Deporting Black Britons was to try and think about where we are now in this conversation, in this generation. And if we want to understand where we are, I think we need to turn to the border. I think that's what the Windrush Scandal tells us. I think that's what the discussions about charter flights tell us. And I think it's what you can hear in conversations, in YouTube videos, in lyrics of songs about people facing deportation, young Black British people and other migrant young people who've grown up here facing immigration control. And that's important to the story. So, in other words, the anti-immigrant racist politics of the last few decades, which we've all been discussing, has culminated in the hostile environment and in the now routine banishment of Black Britons. If we want to assess the situation for young Black Britons today, we need to explore how questions over their belonging might be a legal as much as a cultural matter. We need to recognise that migration is not something which happened back then, but an ongoing process in which people continue to move, but they are illegalized and criminalized in different and new ways. I'm going to speed through a little bit because I've only got a couple of minutes. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that anti-racism in Britain needs to centrally think about the question of immigration control and citizenship, and that's the lesson we get from the Windrush Scandal. And this also raises questions about migrant politics as an invitation to multiracial solidarities and struggles. After all, the hostile environment impacts people who are racialized in different ways. And I had this conversation with people in the book, people who had either been deported and were living in Jamaica or people whose family members and friends had. Some emphasized the experiences of racism, anti-Black racism in particular, that they experienced from police officers and social workers. So, for example, one young man, Marcus, told me that deportation, when reflecting on deportation, said all of this is because men are Black. But at the same time, Marcus, in the same conversation, was talking about police harassment of a friendship group that wasn't exclusively Black. So there were slippages in his account, and that's sort of the point. Whereas other people wanted to distinguish clearly when I asked them about racism and immigration control between what they experienced as people subject to immigration control and their Black British friends who weren't subject to immigration control. And they often remarked, for example, on the fact that when they went to detention, they felt sympathy for and solidarity with Vietnamese and Polish detainees who didn't speak English and actually struggled a lot in detention. In my reading, then, it seems that legal status fractures, complicates, but always builds on anti-Black racism, which we've been talking about this evening. Finally, the last point I'll make before I finish, skip over some other examples of the complexity and the ways in which, for example, the charter flights that we've been active campaigning against, people like me and Sita, have also not actually been able to connect what's been happening to, for example, the charter flights to Albania, which go more frequently. Troublingly, there's not much resistance there. I think we need to think about that. And so finally, clearly what Brexit does is present new challenges for migrant rights and anti-racism. And I want to end with Brexit as a question. Now that it's really happened and the legal realities are actually becoming enforced, legal realities which were previously drowned out by the political theatre of it all, they're starting to take force. And this should be of concern to all of us struggling against racism. As millions of EU nationals lose rights and become deportable, it is those racialised as not properly European, Roma, Black Europeans, Muslims, those with criminal records, and those who have grown up in care. And these categories, of course, overlap extensively. This is the groups that are most likely to be illegalised, detained and deported as the UK leaves the European Union. Given the forces driving Brexit, there won't be any easy way to fold them into the national story. And so for me, thinking about these impending violations and injustices, the future kinds of Windrush scandals we're going to see targeting people who were previously defined as EU migrants can help us think more carefully about what we make of the Windrush scandal, what it means, and what we have to do to resist these kinds of injustices in the future. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. That's, again, another powerful paper, really laying out the difficulties around the notion of having legal citizenship, in a sense that, you know, the legality of status. I mean, I thought what you said about the way in which the deportation actually affirms the value of citizenship. I think that's a really powerful point. I want to open up now for the panel discussion, and I'm going to invite Denise to ask some questions for the panel. And I was going to suggest as well that if the panel have questions about each other's papers, then by all means, you know, please put those on the table as well. But I just wanted to also just say that I thought the presentations were absolutely fire, all of them. So I'm really excited about this, the prospect of this debate. Okay, over to you, Denise.
Hi, thank you. Thank you all for your papers, which were really wonderful. So thought-provoking in a extremely critical way. What seems to run through all of them clearly is interrogating the symbol of Windrush in a whole range of ways, which I find really interesting, which is, you know, what this session is about. And I think what you've done with that is really important. I think if I go to just throw out a couple of questions that are not so much aimed, they're coming out of individual papers, but are aimed at the whole panel. So in different ways, you've all spoken about the way in which the symbol of Windrush is operationalized to do different kinds of work, which is really important. And so rising out of that is, there's a question for me around, maybe I'll do them one at a time. Okay, so Zita, what I got from your presentation was really a question around a reminder that immigration is a form of racial policing. And that connects very much to Luke's presentation as well, and particularly the way in which Luke invites us to think about immigration as a form of racial policing, in which anti-blackness is a structural element of it, but which then ripples out to police the white nation and non-white or othered bodies in different ways. So I'm not asking these questions to you individually. I'm just throwing up some issues that arose that I thought really warrant more unpacking, I guess. And I suppose I began to wonder whether, you know, what would it mean to think about abolishing immigration legislation? Coming to Augustino's presentation. Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many things in there that I want to pick up. I wondered, it seemed to me, Augustina, that you were picking up something, or it was reminiscent of something that Barna Hesse argues in his chapter about Black Britain. She talks about the way in which the 50th year celebration of Windrush kind of disrupted a kind of dominant white gaze of Windrush. At the same time as it didn't eradicate it. It was a celebration of kind of the narrative, I think, that Jade talks about, of this kind of British post-colonial liberal democracy that's anti-racist or is inclusive, that's multicultural. So you very much seem to be talking about the parallel you were making, or the discussion you had around small acts, really made me think about that moment. Think about what kind of story of Black British being told, but how is that still stuck, as you said, within a white gaze, the Britishness. And I think also connected to what you were saying, there seems to be Okay, I'm going to hold on to. I have another question, but I'll hold on till we get into the discussion. So that's what came up for me with Augustino. Jade, another wonderful presentation. Again, very much foregrounding the way in which Windrush comes to symbolize this kind of triumphant multiculturalism, and the way in which that produces all kinds of erasures. And I liked the way, Jade, you drew attention to the way it erases the individual histories of migration, that they just become, we just get this collectivist migration story. And within that, the question that began to come up for me in listening to you, one of the many questions that began to come up was the way in which both Small Axe and the Windrush, the symbol of Windrush, continues to foreground Caribbeanness, Black Britishness as hegemonically Caribbean, which is, and again, Barna writes about how do we, if we think about a longer history of Black Britishness and that goes prior to 1948, or even 1948 and the things that were going on in that time, how does that change the meaning of Black Britishness? And how does it change the way we think about the politics of race in Britain? So that's something that I wanted to kind of particularly pull out from what you said. And then Luke, again, is raising these questions around what, Black Britishness and what it signifies. What do we understand by post-colonial Black Britishness? And how is it connected to what he calls what's the term he using? Post-colonial poetics, of certain kinds of interrogation that constantly bring empire back into the frame. But Luke, what I really found interesting, in one of the many things I found very interesting in what you were talking about, was two things. I think it's so important what you had to say about, anti-racism must center immigration legislation, and I think that connects back to something I can't remember who somebody earlier said, perhaps Jade or maybe Zita, about the way the Windrush narrative constantly presents, in constantly representing the Caribbean immigrants. It perpetuates the idea that we are perpetual immigrants just arriving. And so there's a question about what does it do to constantly present generation after generation people as newly arrived, as always immigrants, which raises the question of something that is again in Barna's chapter. Is Black British an oxymoron? Is it still an oxymoron? And in what way is it an oxymoron? And just finally, Luke, you spoke about national borders, and I guess that raises the question for me around his post-colonial notions of Britishness, of Black Britishness, and how the transnational and the diasporic constantly disrupt. They are themselves multicultural transruptions into this desire to maintain a kind of national borders. So I just wanted to these aren't so much questions as kind of really important themes that seem to be coming out that I hopefully hopefully you will want to respond to, and we can talk about.
So should we start with Rita?
Okay. Yes. So I'm an internationalist, and borders shouldn't be there, in my view. We're living in a global world where people cross borders all the time to work, to form relationships, to connect with each other. Most of our families are global, who come from migrant families. Our families are spread across the world, on different continents. People have always migrated. And there's always been a benefit of migration because people have brought their resources, their skills, their talents, their labour. If you look at what is British culture is made up of the different migrant communities that have come over centuries, not just in recent decades, and that should be something that's celebrated. But we also have this, along with anti-migrant legislation and policies, this policy against multiculturalism, telling us that multiculturalism has failed and people need to conform to some kind of fake norm of what is the new society that you're moving into. But the reality is the society we live in is made up of migrant communities. I think that when you have to look at the difference in treatment. So if you're black or brown and you migrate, you're labeled as this immigrant, you're labeled as somebody who's come in, and we've been scapegoated. Black communities, migrant communities have been scapegoated over the last decade and more, particularly as people come in to strip resources, to steal jobs and to steal housing. And there's this talk of taking away these things from indigenous people. There are no indigenous people in Britain. It's made up of migrant communities. But when British people go and emigrate somewhere else and settle somewhere else, they're expats. So even if you look at the language, they have expectations of that new community they're moving into, to embrace them and to accept them and to accept their culture. But we're told we must integrate into the culture we're going into, which is a fake idea and concept, because there is no British culture to integrate into because of the fact that it's made up of these migrant communities. And if we look at the parallels, for example, of what's happening in the USA to people from Mexico, with what's happening to Caribbean people of the Windrush generation and their descendants, there's a strong connection there. And if we're talking about wanting global economies and living in a global environment where we're on using technology for the last year to connect with each other and to work alongside each other and to communicate, it's a nonsensical idea to police borders and to see that there is ownership of one particular piece of land by one particular group of people. And just on the point quickly that you were saying about what does it mean if you're still treated as if you're an immigrant multiple generations on, it means that you feel stateless, like you have no home and no belonging to that country that you're born in, because you're never treated. I can remember somebody saying to me, "Where are you from?" So I knew what he meant, but I decided to play along with his game, and I said, "I'm from South London." And he said, "No, where are you really from?" And I said, "I'm born here in Britain." And he said, "Yeah, well, I knew you were born here, but you're like foreign like. So where are you really from?" And this is the thing that we face all the time. So in that's a hostile environment. When we talk about the whole Windrush scandal being described as a hostile environment, we're living in a hostile environment every day, where our life chances are less than our white counterparts, where we have to put on a shield and mask every day pre-coronavirus just to step outside and get through that day and shield ourselves from racism, put a mask on and expected to be strong and get through the racism that we're facing every day. So I think that breaking down borders is the same as breaking down those barriers and discrimination that we face. I'm not saying that's an easy thing to do, but it's all part of the same system and all part of the same problem.
We're not hearing you, Lisa.
Sorry, I was just saying, I just wanted to remind the panel that we also want to take some questions from the audience as well. So we're going to try and move through the questions that Denise has posed, so we can leave enough time for the audience's questions as well. So Augustino.
Well, if I could, I have to say I wrote down portions of what Denise was saying, but she had said it was a comment. But I do want to talk about the way in which the Caribbean gets set up as a sort of placeholder for basically everybody who is not white, and in a sense, really, my sense, and I'm speaking now relative to the presentation that I just did, looking, say, for example, at how small acts, how all of those issues are sedimented into small acts. I think what the Caribbean becomes is a sort of miscellaneous Caribbean. It's not a real place. It's a sort of, it's not really existent on any real map at a certain level. And so, it can then become stretched to suit whatever purposes it wants to. And, one of the things that I think of as a very specific way that I would relate to that, which invariably, like, living here, I sometimes find myself rubbing up against that definition. And I can appreciate why people might say it. Like, people would say African Jamaican, or they will say African Caribbean. And invariably, when I think of the Caribbean, I never think of the Caribbean as African in that sense. I think of the Caribbean as Black. And I think that, there's a way in which those kinds of mishmashing of labels together sometimes can erase so much of the nuancing that makes it a specific location. And I think because, in a way, because we're dealing with racism in Britain, where you really are just a homogenous group of others, if you can then feed into that narrative, and if you can stretch and distort these images, then you can just pretty much dump everybody into that category. And I think that, these are, in a way, Windrush is not specifically my area of research, but certainly the Caribbean is. And, I feel like, to a very, very large extent, some of us have been complicit in the maintenance of some of these ideas in the way that we've not been careful in our attention to the details, because those details and specificities are important, and they're important in helping us to disrupt so many of those narratives, because then you begin to see real people emerge, and so you, in a way, really, what you have is a Caribbean that's not the Caribbean. It is everything other than what it really is. And so invariably, sometimes I find it's difficult for me to relate to some of what people say is Caribbean. I look at it and I'm like, what are they talking about? It sounds very British to me. And so, in a sense, really, I think that it's Black Britishness, which is the complex issue that needs to be mapped in specific kinds of ways. And just my final point, insofar as the point I was making in the presentation, is that where you don't attend to those roots, where you don't go back to the beginnings of the story. For example, last week, when I think it was Dr. Said, I think it was, who brought us back to the beginning of the thinking through of the moment around the writing of the book, which has brought us here today. That helps us situate us into proper perspective and gives us a sort of space to engage in a critical and meaningful conversation. And my last comment, I did say it was going to be my last comment is, we also have to be careful how we speak for other people. So sometimes, I've seen panels of Caribbean feminists organized, and they're all foreign people. I can't recognize any of them as any Caribbean, any person. And I'm just thinking to myself, we have been complicit in maintaining a lot of these ideas. And so we have to now begin to challenge ourselves to think outside of these distorted ideas around origins and, this sort of miscellaneous Caribbean space. So I think probably that's all I will say in relation to that.
Jade?
Yeah, in terms of, I guess, responding to Dr. Noble's kind of comments and observations, I guess what has struck me and what I kind of wanted to attend to in my presentation was, this very specific kind of form of historical revisionism that, this country kind of systematically takes part in, and what I would, which I would argue is kind of central to, the kind of, I guess, maintenance of the entire imperial project as an infrastructure. I think by kind of foregrounding this year, 1948, as if, these migrants from the Caribbean appear just out of the blue, and like I said, there's this kind of very benevolent kind of narrative that is formed around them, I think it purposely obscures, you know, what is now more than 5 centuries of you know, British and European at large domination of, you know, people of color throughout the world and Black people in specifically. I think that it also obscures the histories of resistance and rebellion. You know, if you only start with 1948, you don't have to talk about slave rebellions. You don't have to talk about resistance to empire. You don't have to talk about the, you know, the forms of predation that led people to leave their homes to come to this country, which is, you know, coercion. I also think, I've made a few notes, I think it also, you know, in terms of, I guess, centering this idea of Black migration to Britain as solely being a kind of Caribbean experience, it also obscures the breadth of British domination throughout the world. You know, the British Nationality Act was for all kind of people under the so-called New Commonwealth. You know, this was, you know, at its height, Britain colonized 25% of the world's entire population. So I think it, you know, kind of truncates that narrative and kind of locates it in one specific place without attending to the fact that you had migrants from India, Pakistan, Ghana, Nigeria, all of these places coming to Britain because of the forms of capture and domination that were, you know, running riot throughout their home countries. And my final comment would be that in terms of Black Britishness, I definitely think there is a kind of tension within this whole idea of Black Britishness that actually can't be resolved. But I think that tension is actually productive. You know, what does it mean to speak from this location and then speak against this idea of nation, to speak against this idea of borders? So I think rather than kind of trying to sit comfortably within this category of Black Britishness, we should allow it to be, you know, in contention, these kind of two terms to be in contention with each other. That's the pathway to abolition.
Could I also add before we take the questions?
Sorry, let me just get Luke to make his comments and then we can...
Oh, I'm sorry, forgive me. I didn't realize Luke hadn't spoken. Right. My apologies.
So it's okay.
No worries. Thanks so much, Denise. Those questions and comments are great and drew out what I was trying to say. So thanks for phrasing them even better than I had done, for sure. There's so much to respond to there. I mean, I think the question about diaspora, and I suppose what I'm kind of thinking about in a way which I think complements what each of the other 3 speakers have spoken about, is that I do think a framing of diaspora works against the nation, but I'm interested in thinking about if what we are after is something like diaspora against the nation, then what we have to struggle for is more people to have more freedom to move, and less controls on them when they arrive, less immigration raids, less detention centres, to struggle against those things. And so while I think we're used to in the history of anti-racist thought in the UK of thinking about culture in ways which work against the nation, in ways which think about diaspora and which think from the Caribbean, for example, at least theoretically, even if not substantively, as Agostina was making the point. I guess I'm just thinking about the law and struggles over movement and autonomous movement against the material forces of a bordered nation. And I think that's hopefully useful because, for example, when I was listening to Jade's excellent presentation, I was thinking, this is an amazing critique of the fantasies around Windrush, thinking historically about other voyages, thinking about colonial history. I suppose my focus in a way that maybe complements that slightly is to think about puncturing that kind of national inclusive history through thinking about those that are currently in detention centres and those many people, especially Black young men who are in prison and struggling against those forces. And I suppose the only final point to say in connection with Agostina, maybe this relates to what you wanted to say, but I think the disconnect between Black Britain and the contemporary Britain is really important. And I think having people who are currently from the Caribbean engaged in conversations does help. I think it raises also for me the question of immigration control. You know, I mean, again, and this is obviously my line, but part of the reason that disconnect is there is because the movement has been transnational connections have been frustrated by immigration control. And that's a real reason why you might have that disconnect and that conversation lacking. And as you say, it might not be on Prime, but it should be being bootlegged and sent across and all these kinds of things. And that should be happening if it's important to dialogue between these two places. That's a sign of something.
I like that, Lou. So I think, no, I mean, it's, again, it's a set of powerful questions around when we're thinking about the legality and who has the right to move. I think you're absolutely right, Lou, that if that flow of migration from the Caribbean has been halted, then it's even what actually constitutes Black Britishness in that sense. And going back to the kind of questions around what the Windrush narrative is doing, in a sense of its erasure of other populations of Blackness, and how other populations fit under that narrative or evacuated from that narrative. Those are the questions that we have to grapple with, because the Black Britishness, as we can see over a significant period of time, particularly when we're looking at these markers that Professor Hess's paper marked in his keynote last week, we can see that there's a shifting representation of what Blackness is. So if Windrush represents the Black condition, then who constitutes the Blackness within that condition? That's one of the questions that I think we need to be grappling with. We've got 10 minutes before we wrap up the event, and I wanted to ask the panel some questions from the audience. So one of the first questions that came in from Donna Hales, she wrote that, good argument, Augustina. How can we discuss the Caribbean without the centrality of Caribbean-ness?
Well, it's a serious question that I think, in a sense, is really part of what I'm trying to address in my presentation. And, it in a sense links back to the point I was making earlier, that there is a sort of distorted image of the Caribbean that exists in this imagining of roots then, and it's like not a real place, I mean, that has other meanings, outside of that. And so in a sense, I think part of what I think, and these are just really like some early thoughts, part of what I think is that we really have to, in a sense, be pushing from inside Britain to say these visa restrictions and regimes and the what you call it, the steep cost of travel between the region, those things have to be revisited, because in a sense, we know that a lot of the fears, Lisa, you wrote a brilliant article about the anxieties in white spaces in Britain at the time, as it relates to, say, Rastafarian activism in the 70s and so on and so forth. And so the mischaracterization through a very purposely racist kind of set of languages, which have then shaped the sort of administrative responses too, which then is, sedimented into, say, visa restrictions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that, there has to be, I think, a greater push inside Britain itself to begin to say we need to open up these spaces. People need to be moving more readily between the two spaces in order for us to reorganize the paradigms around what we think Caribbean is, but not something that we imagine, with a flag. And no disrespect to the people with flags on their Twitter handles. I'm just saying, sometimes I listen to those conversations and I'm like, what are they talking about? I mean, I can't see myself reflected in any of it, but I leave it there at that. The rest of the panel can talk.
I don't know if anybody else wanted to respond to that. And I think it really does tie into the question around the predominance around the Caribbean as a location that kind of becomes a marker for Black Britishness. But also it's actually even more specific than that. It can actually be just kind of drilled down to Jamaicanness as a marker for Black Britishness, which kind of does a whole lot of erasing of kind of the diasporic formation of Black Britain. So I don't know if anybody wants to kind of comment on that as well.
I think we need to remember that these sort of transnational yearnings for elsewhere or diasporic, a writer whose name escapes me just now talks about diasporic desires. I mean, they are always, in a sense, a response to the difficulty of fully being oneself where one is, right? So that's going to be part of the story of what's going on there. But I think coming at it in slightly different, I don't know if it's a different angle, Augustino. what it's making me think of, when you talk about Caribbeanness in the Caribbean, what I'm hearing you say, and it connects maybe to some of what Jade was talking about, is, the complex genealogy of Black Britishness, right? And often those complex genealogies, and the way they're dispersed across different spaces across the globe, and how those come into the nation, are often raised and underdeveloped in our analysis. And a lot of the sociology of race, for example, in Britain, it works through a certain kind of, a certain representation of the making of Black Britain through Caribbeanness, but doesn't trace in depth the histories of struggle, the history. That's what my work has been particularly interested in doing a close or a genealogy of how Black Britishness is the coming together of these whole range of genealogies that are related to Britain. They're this double articulation of the colonial relation. It's both part of Britain, but also part of not Britain. And I think thinking about these complex genealogies of Black Britishness, however one wants to define them, inevitably brings us, and this is picking up, responding to something from Luke's talk, inevitably forces us to have to rethink the genealogy of Britishness itself.
I just wanted to say that we literally have about 5 minutes left, which is kind of like we're just really getting into the discussion and the debate, the meat on the bones, as I say. But what I wanted to do is just to invite all of you to kind of offer any closing remarks. I really wanted to take some more questions. So we can I'll throw it out. Do you want to take another question from the audience, or do you want to kind of wrap up? Close? I think we should take another question from the audience.
Okay.
Okay. I answered my own question. I'm sorry. So the question is from Bernice Hewson, and she says, do you feel like a series like Small Acts can do more harm than good by maintaining certain silences, telling a story under a white gaze, and potentially reinforcing binaries?
I think the short answer to that is yes, but I'm very careful. It's a kind of yes that I'm pulling back from, because in a sense, really, in listening to Denise's comment in respect of, the complex genealogies of Britishness, part of what I think I'm speaking to is the way Small Acts flattens out the Caribbean as just one thing. And it dismisses it in the process of making it that one thing. And so even the title Small Acts, that's a Jamaican proverb that, arrives at international acclaim through Bob Marley and reggae music. In watching Small Acts, I didn't know how it was Small Acts. I didn't see, even at that level, the kind of relationship then between the complexities of the diasporic origins of these people, because we have to also remember that the people in the Caribbean came from somewhere else. This is something that we have to think about very carefully, that nobody in the Caribbean, with the exception of the First Nation peoples, the Tainos, the Caribs, the Arawaks, who the Europeans encountered in that violent discovery, we have to recognize that everybody else in the Caribbean has come from somewhere else, and everywhere else in the world converges in the Caribbean. So you can meet everybody from somewhere else in the Caribbean. So what I'm saying is, in the way that I looked at Small Acts, it never attempted to engage with any of that, but it is still, marketing itself under the banner of Small Acts. That's a Jamaican proverb, and it's curious to me, those kinds of elisions, and I'm just very interested in understanding what it means.
We've got 5 minutes left if anybody else wants to comment before we wrap up.
I just have a final comment to make on my presentation. I think Luke mentioned kind of, this idea of like national inclusion within my presentation. I just want to make it clear, just so there's not a misreading. Definitely not working towards this idea of inclusion whatsoever. It's very much, you know, all my work is very much about this idea of the brutality of nation and the category of the citizen as necessitating an uncitizen, someone who, you know, violence is directed to. My work in terms of drawing upon critical fabulation within the piece drew upon the kind of testimony and narrative of Evelyn Warchoke, who arrived on the Empire Windrush as a stowaway. So some of those quotes were kind of taken directly from her, and I was really interested in how, you know, there was this kind of like mutual aid whip around the boat to purchase her ticket, and that had been the only difference between, like I said, arriving as a citizen and being charged under the Merchant Shipping Act. And being literally like stowed away to prison. So I'm very much interested in this idea of how the category of citizen, you know, is elastic and can contract in accordance with the desires of nation and empire. So just kind of wanted to clear that up a bit.
Thank you, Jade. Any other final remarks?
Well, I could ask the panel a question. I mean, somebody asked me, but I don't want to necessarily answer it. Somebody asked Jade, and I'm throwing this to you directly because, you know, you talk about Black women. Somebody asked, can we think about Blackness outside of metropole spaces? I mean, I have my own impression of that, what the potential response could be, but I'd be very interested in, say, in your work on critical fabulation, you know, the archive, and so on and so forth. Is it possible for us to have a space where we think of Blackness beyond, outside of, away from the intrusion of the metropole, meaning the white-centered colonial gaze? That was directed to me, but I'm throwing it at you.
I mean, my work does specifically look at Black women in Britain. I think, you know, in that specific area, there's still so much research to be done. I don't think that Blackness necessarily has to always be, I guess, narrated in relation to the metropole. I think there are so many different, you know, ways of engaging this idea of Blackness, this question of Blackness and this history of Blackness. For me, I am interested because those are the stories of, you know, my grandmother, my aunties, my mother. But, you know, who knows what will happen in the future? Maybe I'll move away and look at a different kind of history of relation in terms of this grand narrative of Blackness. I think one of the, you know, amazing things about Blackness is that it is so expansive. So I don't think there would be any way that I could just say that Blackness only exists in relation to the metropole.
Okay.
Well, unfortunately, we are going to have to close this session this evening. It was an amazing episode, amazing discussion, amazing contributions. We're so thankful that you took the time to be thoughtful, to really kind of be careful and creative about your presentations. I just want to say thank you to all of you. And, you know, please join us again next week at 5:30 on next Wednesday, where we'll have our third episode on race, gender, class, and the politics of solidarity in the aftermath of Grenfell. And we'll be joined by Muna Abdi, Adam Elliott Cooper, Monique Charles, Nadine El Ani, and Amina Sakdas. So once again, thank you to our wonderful guests this evening. We wish everybody a safe evening.
Returning home.
Journey. We can't even have a journey home, but you know, wherever you're going, we wish you well this evening, a relaxing evening, if anything. And we'll see you again next week. Okay, good night.
kept when love came down.